Hey folks, welcome back to the Demystify podcast. Today we have a conversation with Dr. Stephanie Seneff. She is an MIT researcher who in the last 10 years has gotten really interested in the question of glyphosate and deuterium and the way that these compounds interact with the metabolism to create a whole slew of diseases. Her entry point into the question was autism, but she also thinks that it's involved in everything from Alzheimer's to cancer, and we sit down with her again for a second conversation to dig into more of the details and to get a little bit more of the story from her.
And you really want to stick through the biochemistry at the beginning of this discussion because we get into some really interesting solution sets and ideas about how we can actually influence the world and make it better about halfway through. And so we need to understand the mechanism of how all of these different chemical interactions are taking place. But hang on as we get super nerdy for that because we're going to make sense of it by the end.
It's just an interesting and important conversation to have because everybody operates with the sense that something is wrong with the food supply. Like Seneff quotes this statistic that 1 out of every 36 kids these days is diagnosed with autism. That is really alarming. And obesity is on the rise, depression, heart disease, cancer, all of these disorders that are really, really damaging our quality of life and our longevity to the degree that, life expectancy in the United States has gone down for the first time in decades. And if we can't understand what is causing these things, then we can never get around to fixing it. And so for me, it's interesting from that perspective. But also, we've talked on the show recently about censorship and the problems with not being able to have these discussions out in the open. And this is a topic that's really difficult to talk about on YouTube. It is borderline skirting their policies about what's allowed in the community guidelines. And that's kind of horrifying because if we can't sit around and talk about, hey, what is actually causing all of the problems in our society, then we can never, ever solve them. And if we're not willing to look at the fact that in some areas of the United States, like east of the Rocky Mountains, hundreds of pounds of glyphosate are applied every single year to agricultural land, which means that all of that is getting accumulated in the environment. It's getting into the rivers, it's getting into people's food, it's in the rain, and we need to solve it. And so having these conversations allows us to get at least a little bit closer in that direction because I make the point towards the end of the episode where we've had massive environmental victories in the past. I know that it's a long time ago, but when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring and it resulted in a ban of DDT, that is direct evidence that it's possible to do these things. And yes, it was a long time ago, it was a different generation, but I really don't think that model is dead. And I think that we're the ones that are responsible for making sure that it's not.
Remember, this is an entirely listener-supported project, so if you can scrape off the tiniest piece of your paycheck to support this podcast going forward, it will ensure that we can put the time and effort into making this a better and better show. And a huge thank you to all of our patrons. We love you guys, and we really enjoy seeing you for our patron Zoom calls every Sunday morning, PST, and I would love to see more of you at that call. So, if you can afford to support the podcast, consider doing it. That's the way that we keep free inquiry alive in the world going forward, and we don't end up having to sell garbage in order to keep our lights on. If you don't have any money, go ahead and share the podcast with somebody or leave a comment, get involved in discussion, come over to Facebook, come over to Discord, talk in the YouTube comments below, and let's grow this thing.
And if you do have some cash, patreon.com/demystify, and we'll see you there.
Enjoy the conversation.
Bye.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
We left a few open threads on our last conversation. I
We
know
did.
that we didn't get into all of the depth of deuterium, and Anastasia was starting to express her concerns about the water supply, and I think there was some discussion about water quality.
But I
And you mean
wonder,
the pot? Oh, you're thinking of the deuterium in the water from like the accident in Japan, or
No, I think that I'm always concerned about water quality, and I'm not
Yeah.
sure. I think that we don't really test water as well as we should because it's one of
Oh,
those
well, that's
things.
certainly true. Yes.
It's one of those things that it's best not to find out because when you find out, you realize that, everything's an EPA Superfund site.
Yes, I
But I think
know.
you also mentioned that you were working on some other publications and maybe dreaming of a deuterium book. And I
I
don't know.
am. I think I'm going to have to write a book on deuterium because it's really hard to publish on it because it's so new that nobody even knows how to review it. I'm putting together, I think, a phenomenal story linking cancer to deuterium. I've been over the years, ever since 2019 December, I've been collecting more data. It's a slow process because the literature is very obscure and a lot of the references are from many decades ago. It gets dropped. Like there's these hints of something big in a paper that's dynamite, in my opinion, and then it gets dropped. Like nobody picks it up. It's so interesting.
Are these mostly observational studies, or are we looking at is this a metabolic mechanism behind all of this?
Exactly. And it is. And so there are many, many, and increasing number of papers coming out on cancer as a metabolic disease, which is already interesting. And I was aware of that from way back, even before I knew about deuterium. I was fascinated by this idea of cancer as a metabolic disease. I'm sure it's true.
Yeah,
When I
Seyfried made
started,
a really, really compelling case to us about this. I think I mentioned that
yeah,
we talked to him before,
I
and
know.
sadly
I did
we
too.
lost the audio to that recording, so we need to meet up with him again later this year.
That's really a
But
shame.
it really changed the way that I looked at a lot of diseases actually. And
Oh, me too. Yes. In fact, I look at all diseases now as a deuterium problem. It's quite
oh wow.
interesting.
In
All
the
chronic
metabolic
diseases.
sense?
Well, yes, mitochondria getting wrecked by deuterium. I think it's systemic and central.
Okay, so let's maybe unpack this a little bit. So we
Yep.
have deuterium, we have metabolism, and we have cancer. Can you kind of broad strokes, because one of the complaints we got last time is that we got too nerdy about biochemistry.
We're going to do that again this time. I guarantee it. That's the only
Well,
way.
I'm not a biochemist, so I'll try to dumb it down for
Yeah,
people.
okay, you gotta
I
simplify it.
But
appreciate
maybe we
having a
can actually
biochemist,
start.
for someone who knows biochemistry to talk to, and I understand what they meant by that because we were deep diving into the biochemistry. But sorry, go ahead and say.
Well, I think that it's important to start. I mean, obviously, deuterium, it's a heavy form of hydrogen. How prevalent is it in nature? So, for just pre industrial human beings, when are we encountering deuterium in the wild?
All the time. It's everywhere. It's
Okay.
pervasive, and it's natural.
And it's
a
in our
natural
food,
element.
it's in our water, it's just
Everywhere.
coming into our
It's
body
in
constantly.
everything. Yes, and it's like calcium. You can think of minerals. It's kind of like a mineral actually, and it's at the concentrations of a mineral. In fact, it's much more common as on a molecule by molecule. I mean, on an atom by atom count, it's 5 or 6 times as much in the blood as calcium. In that
And
ballpark.
is
So
that
it's like
because
a mineral in terms of its, amount. Yeah.
is that in the form of heavy water that it's mostly coming to us,
Uh,
or
Mostly in heavy water, but it's also attached to various molecules, in organic molecules. It goes everywhere hydrogen goes. So it's in glucose. It's in everything, all the foods.
And so, in a normal organism, are there systems for cleaning deuterium out of the environment and out of the food supply so that it doesn't start to deteriorate the body? Or is this just kind of a feature of being alive that you gradually accumulate deuterium, it messes with your metabolism, and that contributes to aging and degradation and eventual death? Or how do you see it?
That's where people get confused, right? It's a natural element, so it's probably safe, right? And in fact, it would be safe if not for all the chemicals that are poisoning our metabolic processes. It actually has a benefit, and the body knows that. The organism is so clever because it knows that deuterium makes the bones strong. So it dumps deuterium into the bones. And it knows that deuterium wrecks the mitochondria, so it keeps deuterium out of the mitochondria. So it's a matter of not being able to put the deuterium where it needs to be. That's the problem, not the deuterium.
that's really
It's like
interesting.
iron. Iron can be both toxic and deficient at the same time, and that can happen because of glyphosate exposure.
And so
Glyphosate messes things up.
Okay, let's figure out how that works.
well, so before we get to that, I want to center around the discovery and your interest in deuterium? Because how did you come to even find out that this was something? You said that you're reading through the literature, you're noticing patterns, people aren't picking up on it, but you're piecing these ideas together. What are you seeing that's leading you down this path? And because I know that you came into this from glyphosate and autism, but did you have a sense of deuterium's importance?
Don't say that word on our show.
Deuterium's importance before you got there?
I didn't think about deuterium at all until I happened to get an email, a blind email from Laszlo Boros, Professor Laszlo Boros. I didn't know who he was. He said, "Oh, great paper. You read a paper that I had written together with Greg Nye. You liked it. It was a metabolic paper. And it was about glyphosate messing up metabolism." And he said, "Great paper." He said, "By the way, do you know about deuterium?" And I didn't. So I said, "No, tell me more." And then we've developed a good friendship, and we've collaborated now on a couple of papers, and I want to collaborate on more papers with him. He's sort of Mr. Deuterium, as far as I can tell, in the West. I don't know anybody else. I may be stepping out of line and saying this, among the professionals in the Western world that are sort of more known for deuterium than he is. He's invented this coined deuteronomics he coined a word called deuteronomics as a sort of study of deuterium. And he's coined a word called depletion, which is deuterium depletion. So he has these interesting words that he creates, and he's quite an interesting character. I have to say, I've met so many interesting people through this whole process. It's just been amazing. And I really appreciate people reaching out to me with an idea. And if it grabs me, I go after it, and that's how I've really, my research has advanced in breakthrough ways at punctured points in my life when I met somebody who had some information that totally blew my mind. It's happened multiple times, Gerald Pollack, and then of course, where am I going? Gerald Pollack, and then Don Huber. Don Huber was the one who introduced me to glyphosate. I dropped everything and started studying glyphosate. And really, when I got to deuterium, I kind of dropped everything and started studying deuterium as well, because it fit so well. As soon as I looked, I realized this has got to be it. It's just the same kind of epiphany that I had when I attended the lecture by Don Huber on glyphosate.
And it's got to be it in the sense that the body is losing its ability to sequester it in the right places. And so it's ending up in the mitochondria instead of in the bones and these other inert places.
Yes, exactly. And in fact, I already knew that glyphosate messes up dehydrogenases, many, many dehydrogenases. For example, in the soil, there's a study on soil bacteria where they exposed the soil in one-shot deal to glyphosate, and then they looked over time. And they saw over time that the dehydrogenases got less and less effective. Their activity went down over time for like 3 weeks, and then it started to recover. Just from that one exposure 3 weeks ago, it went down. So I believe glyphosate suppresses all the dehydrogenases. And there's a reason for that, because they have a perfect glyphosate susceptibility motif that we talked about last time, where they bind phosphate at a site where glycine is highly conserved. In fact, they have 3 glycines in a pattern, in what they call GXXG pattern. 3 glycines that bind to a phosphate in an ATP, in an NAD molecule and in an FAD molecule. They often have 2 such sites. So these dehydrogenases are very susceptible to glyphosate's mischief, all of them. And studies have shown succinate dehydrogenase, succinate dehydrogenase, glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, both of those have been shown to be suppressed in us with glyphosate studies.
So what's
it's not just
to
the
me
microbes.
Is that you can see these individual effects, right? Like, so if you do an experiment where you look at specific molecular effects, and so the dehydrogenases are really important. You mentioned these molecules, FAD and NAD, and these are molecules that serve as, they balance the electrical state of the cell. Like, there's this thing called redox. There's redox balance inside of the cell. And I'm saying this not for your benefit. I'm saying this for the benefit of the people listening. Where it's so there's a teeter-totter, right? If you become too electronegative, you have problems. If you become too electropositive, you have problems, because these molecules are kind of shuttled around the cell, and their relative abundance is important for the ability of reactions to proceed. So basically, go ahead.
The amount of the balance between the like NADH and NAD plus, NADPH and NADP plus, they're in a particular balance in the body. that works well. And when they get out of balance, that's not good. And you've got metabolic disorders. Yes.
And it's like, it's a global thing, because basically what happens is that these little molecules, I kind of always viewed them as being facilitators of reactions, where, you remember back in the day from intro chemistry, which is that if you have more reactants than products, the reaction will run towards the
Right.
product side of things. If you have more products than reactants, it runs in the opposite direction. And because so many of the enzymes inside of our metabolic system can go both ways, you have to have the right amount of these molecules, because they push the reaction in the right direction without you having to consume energy to actually get the desired outcome, which is normal cellular function.
Is this how people come to be selling alkaline water and things like this?
I think that this is the science that they base a lot of that stuff on. Yeah, which is that you need to balance the body. You're getting, I remember back in the day, maybe like 15 years ago now, I ran into a girl who was like she was an artist, and she was really into alternative health stuff. And she was like, it's really important to consume alkaline foods because your blood gets acidified. And I was like, I don't know if that's possible. Like, I feel like the blood is maintained in a pretty tight window for homeostasis, and if it gets acidified,
Not to mention the stomach is incredibly acidic.
the stomach is incredibly acidic. But I think that the grain of truth in that is that you do have to have this proper redox balance. And so if your cells are out of whack, you're not going to be able to perform the reactions of metabolism. And the idea is that deuterium in the wrong place is preventing these enzymes from actually creating the right balance of these exchange tokens, the FADs and the NADs inside of the
Actually,
cells.
the FAD is a facilitator of the movement of the protons from the substrate to the product in these dehydrogenases. And the substrate is something that's got some hydrogen in it, and it's taking the hydrogen out. Right? Dehydrogenase takes out 2 hydrogen atoms and delivers them to somebody else. And often who it delivers to is NAD+.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes NADH. And NADH is pretty much, in my opinion, the universal donor of protons to the mitochondria. NADH dehydrogenase, which is also suppressed by glyphosate, is the enzyme that takes the H off of NADH and puts it into the mitochondrial intramembrane space. So that's the key enzyme that's supplying H to the ATPase pumps, and the pumps hate G. They hate deuterium. It really gums them up, and it can break them, and it'll certainly cause reactive oxygen to be released. It makes inefficient production of ATP. All bad, really bad, actually. Mitochondrial dysfunction. You can find tons and tons of papers about mitochondria being sick and spewing out too much reactive oxygen and not producing enough ATP. That is an extremely common symptom of all kinds of neurodegenerative diseases and everything else, really basic. And that's a signal that mitochondria are getting hurt by deuterium. I see that. Whenever I see that, I say that's deuterium.
And so, what's the kind of evidence that Laszlo Boros brought to you that really tripped you into this?
Yeah, well, so I read the paper that he handed me a paper that went with his message, and the paper was something he had written. I think he published it in Medical Hypotheses. A great paper, really fun. And he showed the deuterium tracing through the metabolic processes of metabolism, and basically, glycolysis and citric acid cycle, the basic glucose metabolism pathway, and where the deuterium ends up and where it gets stripped out. It's really fascinating. I've gotten really intrigued by this. And he gave me a quote: all isomerases are involved in deuterium management, all of them. And that has made me be very, very interested in isomerases. And there are several isomerases that take place in metabolism, some in the glycolysis and some in the citric acid cycle. And every time there's an isomerase, it's so fascinating. I'll give you a good example, which is triose phosphate isomerase. We probably talked about it last time because that's pretty central. Triose phosphate isomerase. It's so cool. So glucose has 6 carbons, right? It's a 6-carbon sugar. This is pretty basic biology, so I'm sure you know it, but your audience won't get too confused by this, I hope. And there's a process that cuts it in half, and now you've got 2 3-carbon sugars, 2 of them. That's triose phosphate, right? They've got a phosphate attached to them, triose phosphate. So these 2 triose phosphates have exactly the same atoms on them, but they're arranged differently. And isomerases typically swap back and forth between two different arrangements of the same set of atoms. That's how you define them, really. So these two molecules are the same, except they're not, because their atoms aren't in the same place. And the triose phosphate isomerase swaps them back and forth between the two. And there's a fantastic video that I watched, and unfortunately I can't remember the name of he was a scientist who was an expert on triose phosphate isomerase, and he gave a lovely YouTube video describing it. It was so great, because that really helped me to have an insight about how deuterium works and how we fix it. So what happens with that isomerase is that it goes both ways, but it likes to go this way. So it likes to put things here, and then it dribbles a few more back, right? So this guy gets a huge pile, and this one only a little bit, right? Because of that equilibrium. And this guy is the only one that will go away through another enzyme that is a dehydrogenase that takes it along a pathway that eventually gets out of the glycolysis pathway. So the idea is this guy spits out a few, they get grabbed away, he spits out a few more because it keeps trying to get back to equilibrium. They're being dribbled out. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. This guy's the only one who'll go that way. This one stays behind. And this process of putting it here, putting it back here, you lose the deuterium. Either the deuterium falls off into the water on the way in, or it stays over here when it gets there. It gets trapped. The guy who, when it goes this way, doesn't like to take deuterium. It's so clever. It's a wonderful example. And I suspect there's a lot of enzymes like that. And there are other isomerases. For example, there's another one that goes from, I think, from glucose to mannitol. I'm not sure if that's right. I think it's mannitol and glucose. It's an isomerase that goes back and forth between those two. Same thing. And the mannitol one, so only the glucose one goes forward. The mannitol one ends up with deuterium. So there's a process of dropping off the deuterium over there before I go forward. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And are these in different compartments of the cell?
Well, I don't know where that glucose isomerase one takes place. It's probably in the cytoplasm. So yes, so maybe it's mostly in the cytoplasm, because you want to dump the deuterium into the water. You don't want to do that in the mitochondria. They're probably all in. I would go out on a limb and say they're all in the cytoplasm, not in the mitochondria. That would be my guess.
Yeah, you need. I think that you stay in the cytoplasm until you get to acetyl-CoA.
No, that's right. That's what feeds into the mitochondria for the citric acid cycle. But there's a lot of other activities that go on in the mitochondria that are not related to the citric acid cycle. But I would bet money that all the isomerases are outside.
Mm-hmm.
So when glyphosate interferes with this, what is the outcome?
Well, for example, supposing glyphosate suppresses the isomerase that whisks it away, right? So I've got this guy, and he comes over here and he doesn't get whisked. He gets whisked away slowly because glyphosate's messing things up, right? So this doesn't go as efficiently as it should. And these guys pile up. They all pile up because this is not coming away. This one can't come away, or at least it comes away very much more slowly. It eventually becomes glycerol. It's actually quite interesting. And glycerol also doesn't get metabolized, which is also very interesting. So I think glycerol has high deuterium. That would be my guess from that argument. So it gets tricky again. We're going to be into heavy duty biology, but so the two of them both kind of get backed up because this guy's not taking it away, right? And what happens then is that you get methylglyoxal. These are triose. These are 3-carbon sugars with a phosphate attached to them, and they spontaneously get converted to methylglyoxal. If you know about methylglyoxal, it's probably the most dangerous glycating agent known to mankind. Extremely glycating, much worse than fructose, which is much worse than glucose.
Let's talk about glycating.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Yeah, you guys know about glycating, right?
Not as much as I should. I mean, I know it in the sense of glycan chains in bacteria. So I didn't study human biology and metabolism. I studied bacterial metabolism, and so
that's interesting.
When it applies to some degree to human metabolism. But so my sense of glycation is probably different.
I studied the elasticity of water, so I need a
you both
complete refresher.
Okay, that's all right. Well, so you know about hemoglobin A1C? Have you heard of that? Hemoglobin A1C.
In theory.
I know with hemoglobin, I got that much.
Yeah, well, that's a test that they do for diabetes, hemoglobin A1C. It can give you a sense of how you've been doing over the last 3 months. In terms of the diabetes, of course, is an excess sugar problem. Excess sugar in the blood is a glycating agent. It causes proteins to get sugar stuck onto proteins, and it's not good. It's a spontaneous reaction that happens when it's too much sugar, and that's a big. So when you have diabetes, that's a big problem because your proteins get messed up through glycation damage. And that happens anywhere that sugar is in excess. And 3-carbon sugars are really bad.
What do they
Glucose-
do? What do they do to the cells?
Well, basically they gum it up with sugar, you could say. They gum up the protein with sugar, and then this protein doesn't work properly anymore.
Well, because you can imagine the way that sugar affects water, right? So if you have a protein that's able to move through water in a specific way, the minute that you start to add sugar to it, you're making it much bulkier. You're making it much more difficult to move around and literally, stickier, right? Like if you have a little bit of sugar water on your fingers and you touch it together, it's literally gum.
Right. I mean, so if you think about the proteins being soaked in sugar, you can't think that would be good for them. And in fact, LDL, the LDL particles that people worry about, high LDL is going to give them a statin drug. Those particles get gummed up with sugar through glycation damage. And that causes them to not behave well. In fact, it blocks them from being taken up. And that's how you can get high serum LDL, because it can't get taken up by the cells because it's gummed up with sugar. I mean, that's a very intuitive example. But people who know diabetes, hemoglobin A1C is a popular test to see how you're doing. And you get a number. I don't know, in the American terms, I think it's around 7 would be considered high. And then anything higher than 7 would be dangerous, would be diabetes, basically. Should be under 7 if you're healthy. The number that comes out with the hemoglobin A1C test, and that's looking for glycation damage on the hemoglobin protein that's in the red blood cells. It's a sort of way to see if you've got too much sugar in your blood.
And you're saying that this methyl glycan builds up spontaneously and then starts to just stick to random proteins?
Methylglyoxal is a 3-carbon sugar that's very reactive, and it reacts with all the proteins that are in the cell, messing them up. And so it causes devastation to the cell if there's too much of it. You can look it up. If you search methylglyoxal diabetes, you'll find a bunch of articles on that topic. And so when you don't have that dehydrogenase pulling that away, the triose pile up, and then you get diabetes. And of course, diabetes is one of the conditions that's going up dramatically, exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate usage.
And so is it diabetes exactly, or is it a different disorder that mimics the effects of diabetes? Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think it's diabetes exactly, because that's what diabetes is, high blood sugar causing problems. So it's just that the triose phosphates might pile up more than they should because of the glyphosate, and that's what's causing the underlying problem that's causing the sugar to become a problem, because of the blockage of that enzyme.
Okay, so one thing that immediately comes to mind is that there's different metabolic processes for fats and proteins than there are for sugars.
For sure.
Is this a similar level of issue for fatty acid metabolism and protein metabolism? Or is this specific, are these deuterium problems specific to glycolysis?
Well, they can definitely be involved with the fatty acid synthesis. Fatty acid synthesis has dehydrogenases as well. And in fact, there's one, and I won't be able to give you the full name of it, something about Aryl, Aryl, something lipid dehydrogenase. I found an enzyme. I was really intrigued by it because it had a whole, there's a tool that I use. You can throw the proteins sequence into this tool and turn the crank, and it will show you places, sequences that it's called motifs. Remember I said GXXG motif. So there's these various motifs that they know about in proteins that are associated with certain sites that bind phosphate. Actually, in this specific case, it's all about binding phosphate. And that's what I care about, because that's what glyphosate messes up, binding phosphate. And this particular, I'm sorry that I don't remember its name. It has a complicated name with some kind of lipid, but and actually there's several of these different ones in the metabolism of lipids. And but this particular one caught my eye because there's a genetic defect. This is really interesting to me. There's a genetic defect. If you have a defective version of that protein, which is a dehydrogenase, and it deals with the fats. So it pulls hydrogens out of fats. If you have a defect in that protein, you end up with a very bad disease, a genetic disease, where, and the interesting thing about it is that you become extremely sensitive to all kinds of foods, and you become a very picky eater. So all these kids that are picky eaters today, there are so many of them. I am just amazed at even my grandchildren. I hate to admit, some of them, they don't like anything except the stuff they shouldn't be eating, right? Picky eaters, and amazingly, this particular genetic defect causes that. which makes me think glyphosate's causing it by messing up this enzyme. It's a possibility.
I think Anastasia's little brother went through several years where he only ate macaroni and cheese or something.
It wasn't macaroni and cheese. He would only eat orzo pasta, plain. And not rice. It had to be orzo pasta. And it was devastating for my mom because my mom was like, look, being a picky eater is probably one of the worst things that you can do. And she was also terrified that he was going to, die of malnutrition. And
I
so
know, that's
the process of figuring out how to force him to eat
He's
fruits
very
and
strong and healthy now,
It
surprisingly.
amazes me that these kids that are eating what I consider to be total junk, and yet they seem to be thriving. It's amazing to me that they're able to do so well on such a restricted diet. But there are so many kids these days. I don't think it was like that in the past. I really don't. I don't remember having picky eaters when I was a child. I don't remember anybody who was a picky eater.
I think there was
I wasn't allowed.
Yeah.
My mom was like, you're finishing everything on your plate.
Yeah. And I think that it's also a reaction that happens in time, right? Like you grow up being told that you have to eat everything and you suffer tremendously, and then you have your own kids and you're like, I'm never going to do that to my kids. And so it's a cycle that goes back and forth. But I think that it points to something interesting, this thing that you said, where the kids seem to be thriving. Like
that is amazing that they can appear to be very healthy. I mean, often I think they have food sensitivities that can lead to allergic reactions and things like that. A lot of them have. We have so many allergies to peanuts and gluten. I mean, just incredible number of things that people can't eat anymore. That's another thing that I get bugged by, because you invite some people for dinner and they say, oh, well, I can't eat gluten, and then I can't eat casein, and then, they're just like this big list of things that you have to not put into your dinner plan. And it becomes very difficult to cook for these people, because they're sensitive to all these foods. I think it's to me, it's very disturbing that so many people have all these food problems.
So why is it that it's been so difficult historically to show a clear-cut relationship between all of these environmental agents, such as glyphosate and other pesticides and the herbicides, and direct and clear health consequences? Because I think that this is what this always comes down to, is that and we talked about this last time a little bit, that when you start to look through the literature, there's enough biochemistry and there's enough background that you can make a solid argument for the fact that there is an effect. And yet when it comes to showing that, let's say, glyphosate directly causes cancer, that's still an elusive conclusion inside the peer-reviewed literature. And so what do you make of that?
Well, one thing I make of it is that there's a tremendous amount of censorship, and I know that for a fact. I get my papers bounced without review. Journal just won't go near it, because they don't want to face this issue with the companies that are often supplying money. I mean, it's really the companies that make these products are very good at spreading the wealth around to make sure that anybody who might fight them isn't going to want to do that. I think that is a huge problem.
Are they litigious? Do they actually come after the journalists for publishing papers that they consider slanderous?
I don't know. I know that for example, I have had journals, more than one journal has published my papers and then gotten a huge amount of flack from the companies that I threatened, to the point where they were tempted to retract it. I have this one story with Entropy, which was the journal where Anthony Sampson and I published our first paper on glyphosate in the journal Entropy. And it was right around the time that Seralini's paper got retracted. I think I talked about this last time.
A little bit.
Professor Seralini has a team in France, and he's done some great work on glyphosate. And he published a paper right around the time that I discovered glyphosate from Don Huber. I remember going back home and wanting to look for glyphosate papers, and I came across this one, and it hadn't been retracted yet, and it was amazing. And that was the paper, actually, that on top of Don Huber's talk, finding that paper, I said, this has got to be it. It made me even more confident to go forward with this. And that paper was, he basically reproduced an experiment that had been done by Monsanto as part of the approval process, where they had exposed rats to low-dose glyphosate over a period of time. And Monsanto stopped at 3 months, whereas Seralini kept going after 3 months. And he didn't see any real issues at 3 months, but by 4 months, he started to see problems. And by the time they finished off their lifespan, the females had massive mammary tumors, and the males had kidney problems and liver problems, and both genders had reproductive issues, and they died young. He found all of that, but it was after 3 months. Of Glyphosate is a slow kill, and that is a big feature of it. That's how it sneaks by, because it's a slow kill. And they've rigged the experiment so that you don't see the thing that's happening. They also, it's an endocrine disruptor, and endocrine disruptors are peculiar because they are more toxic at low doses, very low doses, than they are at high doses.
Really?
Monsanto set up a rule. Yeah, that's really fascinating, very counterintuitive.
Mm-hmm.
I think Monsanto folks figured that out. I think they were probably looking at glyphosate at low doses and seeing trouble. And then they got this idea, well, let's just say that if it doesn't show any problems at high doses, you don't have to go any lower than that. I mean, they actually made a formal rule that as long as the high dose doesn't show toxicity, you don't have to go lower.
Is that because the body has some threshold balance, like that it can, some check or balance that it's able to deal with something if it detects it, but not if it can't detect it above some threshold? Like, that's a really, really bizarre result. I can't think of any other substances like that.
Very counterintuitive, and I don't entirely understand why either. But I'm suspecting that when it is at low doses, it's at the proper. So it's very. The glyphosate molecules are not all piled up, right? They're well separated from each other, and it's at a concentration level that's typical of hormones. Hormones are very low concentration, and then it starts acting like a hormone. And picking up with the hormonal receptors. I mean, for example, glycine is a neuro. What's it called? I lost the word. Oh shoot! I can't believe I lost that word. Neurotransmitter. Sorry, I was going the wrong way. Glycine is a neurotransmitter, and glyphosate is a glycine molecule, except that it has extra stuff. So glyphosate may act like glycine as a neurotransmitter, only it blocks. It goes to the same place glycine goes, and then it doesn't work properly because of that extra stuff. So it essentially blocks. I mean, a lot of toxins have the effect of binding to a receptor, blocking the ability of the normal thing that binds to it, like a serotonin receptor, blocking its ability to bind and then messing up the whole system. So I think just acting as a glycine analog is part of how it's doing it. People have shown, there was a study on breast cancer cells grown in culture. They exposed them to glyphosate at parts per trillion. That is extremely tiny, parts per trillion. And they saw that it increased they started proliferating more. It caused the cancer to grow at parts per trillion. And I think when there's a small amount, these receptors are, as concentrations matter, because if things get too cluttered up, they sort of, they in a sense, they just can't even quite make it to the receptor because there's too many of them. They might even like gel the water or something. I don't know what it's doing, but some way in which it can no longer be taken up because there's too much of it. It actually prevents the cell from taking it up because there's too much, I suspect. And that it's tricky to know exactly what's going on, but it is very counterintuitive.
Can you think of any other substance that's like that is toxic at low doses?
Yeah, everything that's a hormone that messes up the hormones. An endocrine disruptor. There's a whole class of them. I mean, there's all kinds of toxins that people are aware of that are endocrine disruptors, and and they know that that research community knows that these endocrine disruptors are more toxic at low doses. That's a well-known phenomenon.
Well, so there's the phenomenon that I'm well aware of is called hormesis, which is actually, it works often in the opposite direction, where like very small quantities of something are beneficial and then large quantities are really negative. But I imagine that, the inverse of hormesis is also in effect. It seems plausible that, because antibiotics are like that. In small quantities, antibiotics are bacterial signaling molecules. They produce them themselves because they're a natural product, and they use them for quorum sensing, they use them for communication, they use them for defining the architecture of biofilms. And then if you give them, horse doses of antibiotics, it kills them because it overwhelms systems. And I can imagine that based on the occupancy of receptors and, like you said, these biomechanical properties of the way that the molecules interact with the massively complex interior structures of the cell. Like, it might be that, maybe you start to get polymers of it at high concentrations. And
yeah, exactly. There's some way that it's and it may even just shape differently when there are so many of them bumping into each other. I don't know. It's hard to know why, but it is certainly a well-known phenomenon in that community that these endocrine disruptors are more toxic at low levels.
I can imagine some sort of transporter being triggered at a certain threshold as well. where you actually have an active process by the body to remove the molecule.
Yeah, that could be. And it might even sort of agglomerate together, right? The glyphosates might all buddy up into some complex thing that actually sequesters all of them, for example. That's quite possible if they get too high. Because a lot of proteins have that property of forming, all these aggregates that get formed from proteins when they get into too high concentration. That's what goes on with like amyloid beta and alpha-synuclein, all those proteins that can misfold and form these aggregates that are like plaque, like Alzheimer's plaque. Those things happen when the concentration is high. That's what triggers it. And so it's possible, actually, that glyphosate just kind of gloms all of it together in one bunch that can't get into the cell because it's all stuck together, right? If it gets to a high enough concentration. That's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought of that until just now. So that might be what's going on.
Yeah, that story is really interesting. We had a researcher recently who was working on the amyloid process during his postdoc, maybe it was during his PhD. And he was really shocked to find out that treating these plaques themselves didn't really seem to relieve the symptoms of the disease. And so
that's so true. I've been all over that. I am so frustrated with the industry devoting all this money. The pharmaceutical industry has piles and piles of money have been devoted to trying to get rid of the plaque, get some kind of antibody that will bind the plaque or even redissolve the plaque, just get rid of the plaque. It is a totally wrong approach. I actually have been fussing with a speculative theory, a hypothesis that the amyloid beta plaque traps deuterium. And in fact, all of these misfolded proteins trap deuterium. I'm suspecting that that's the case. And I'm really wanting to nail that. I want to get enough, of a story from the literature to make sense out of that, because I just intuitively, I think that must be what's going on.
But if you removed the plaques, then wouldn't you help rebalance the deuterium?
You bring the deuterium back into the water. It's trying to sequester the deuterium so that it's not poisoning the cell.
I see.
And
so it's
when
a reaction.
You redissolve it, you redissolve the deuterium as well, and now the cell is sicker because the mitochondria are getting wrecked. So that would make total sense.
That's really interesting.
So let's see if we can, now that we have more or less a sense of the deuterium balancing being necessary for healthy metabolism, how do we reconceive of cancer as a metabolic disease?
Yes, that's so interesting. And I've been really, really into that. And of course, cancer, if you've read about cancer's metabolic perversions, you'll see that it's very, very strange the way cancer cells carry on.
What are some of the perversions?
Well, for example,
they don't metabolic perversions.
Yeah, they have mitochondria, but they often don't really use them to make ATP. They make massive amounts of ATP through glycolysis. They do massive amounts of glycolysis, which is converting glucose. They actually convert it into lactate instead of acetylcoenzyme A. Normally it becomes acetylcoenzyme A and it feeds into the citric acid cycle, but they actually bypass the acetylcoenzyme A and go straight to lactate from pyruvate. And then they dump the lactate. They ship it out. And that is extremely interesting to me. And that's I actually have written about that before I knew about deuterium. I had suspected then that cancer comes about because of metabolic problems, and that cancer is trying to actually help out the body as far as providing it with nutrients that will be beneficial. And lactate is certainly one of those nutrients. It qualifies very much. In fact, the brain, the neurons love lactate. The support cells for the neurons, like the astrocytes, they actually they do the same thing as the cancer cells. They take in glucose, they spit out lactate, they give it to the neurons, and the neurons take the lactate and say, thank you very much. They love that lactate.
Interesting.
And so the cancer cell is pouring lactate into the blood. And in fact, you can measure blood lactate as a marker of cancer. There's other diseases that also have high lactate, but certainly cancer does.
Does that make deep thinkers more susceptible to cancer?
Because they have to use more energy in the neurons, so they need more lactate. That could be.
That's terrifying.
That'd be interesting.
So you said something about the sense that cancer might be beneficial. That's kind of an unusual.
Absolutely, yes. So they make that lactate. The lactate is, and the liver likes lactate. The heart loves lactate. And the brain, the liver, heart, and brain, all very important organs. They get the lactate. They say, thank you very much. That's wonderful. And in fact, it's interesting. Alzheimer's protects from cancer. And I suspect cancer protects from Alzheimer's. They're sort of mirror images of each other. Alzheimer's is like, okay, guys, you've got a really bad mitochondria here. We really can't afford to use them because we're going to wreck the brain if we do. So let's just put the brain in hibernation, And cancer is, okay, that brain needs nutrition. I'm going to supply it with lots of lactate so it can be healthy. And then I'll just get bigger and hope that everything will be okay. They're both fighting the same problem, but in opposite ways.
Is there a way to just supply your body with plenty of lactate so it doesn't need to initiate cancer for this process?
Well, that is probably not a bad idea. I think foods that contain lactate are healthy foods. I like the fermented dairy products, for example.
Yeah, that's a good
foods.
example. Just yogurt and...
Exactly. I love sour cream, a full-fat sour cream.
Sounds delicious.
Yeah, something that people were asking about in the comments from the other conversation was, things that they can actually do to help resolve this. Do you have a sense of that?
Get cancer.
Oh no, that sounds dicey. Because I mean, like, if it's beneficial, shouldn't there be systems that are controlling it and keeping it from
Well, there are, and in fact that's why the deuterium level stays low. I tell you, I found a fantastic paper, and this was even after I'd already thought that cancer is a response to deuterium. I found a wonderful paper, and it showed that, and this was just so perfect. They had these cancer cells growing in culture. They exposed them to water that was high in deuterium, and not like extraordinary amounts, but like twice as much as normal, twice the concentration as normal. And then they had another set of cancer cells. They exposed them to half the concentration as normal. And then they had the normal ones. So they had 3 different groups of cancer cells, all the same kind of cells, growing in 3 different water environments. And which ones would you think would thrive, and which ones would you think would die? Trick question.
I mean, so if cancer cells are producing lactate and they're skipping the mitochondria in general, then it would seem like the condition that degrades the mitochondria would induce them to grow better, because then they have less of a metabolic load of maintaining their mitochondria.
Yeah, I actually think that the whole organism has developed this system that is a strategy to, in a situation where deuterium levels are getting too high, grow a cancer in order to solve that problem. Grow a cancer in order to solve it. And so when you put in twice as much deuterium, they thrive, they proliferate, they're very happy. When you put in half as much, they die, they commit apoptosis, they die. Isn't that amazing? So they're sensitive to the level of deuterium. And when it's high, they kick into action because they're like, oh my God, we got deuterium. I mean, I'm thinking of them as having little brains. We've got a deuterium problem here. We got to fix it. That's our job. And so they start, proliferating in order to have more of them so they can do even a better job if there's more of them, right? They can make more lactate.
Is there a way to deprive them of deuterium in your diet?
Well, that's where you drink deuterium depleted water. And that's where this guy, Somolyav, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Somly, something like that. I forget exact. Somolyav. Can't quite get it. I'm not so good with names. Somolai, Somlyaa. Somolai. I think that's right. He's devoted his, at least the last 20 years, maybe more. I think more. He's had 2 books, and I read his second book end to end. And it's a dry read, I have to say. It's just one case study after another. But I was quite interested because he had so many examples of people often people came to him after the mainstream had given up on them. They had terminal cancer. They were expecting to die in the next couple of weeks, that kind of thing. And he'd put them on this deuterium depleted water program, and they would get better. They would live a lot longer than was expected. And he also had patients who came in right away and got deuterium depleted water along with their chemotherapy and whatnot.
And that has to be produced in a laboratory, this deuterium depleted water.
Yeah, it's not natural, unfortunately.
There's no wonderful natural spring I can go to and
Well, there is actually. You can get water down to like 100 parts per million. 155 is what's in seawater. You can get it down to 100 apparently from, like, for example, glacier ice off of Antarctica. So the glaciers hold on to the deuterium, and they release deuterium depleted water. What melts off of the glaciers is depleted. And so, in fact, Iceland has fantastic health. And I have suspected, once I started studying about deuterium, I thought, maybe that's why. Because in Iceland, they have all this glacier water. That's just, glaciers are the source of their water supply.
Can I just melt ice cubes?
Yeah, well, maybe. Maybe you could, but you'd have to have some very big ice cubes and just take a little bit off. You could probably.
I'd never been a huge fan of ice cubes, but now I'm opening my mind to the idea.
There you go. Well, you have to drink the water off them before they melt. So that's a dicey.
If you melt them completely, you won't do anything. You have to have a big mass of ice and just take a little water off of it. So it's pretty hard to do.
Are there foods that scrub deuterium from the body, or processes that scrub deuterium?
Well, there are
from the
foods
body?
that are naturally low in deuterium, and I think those are really healthy foods, and they're mostly fats. Fats have lower deuterium than sugars, for sure. And in fact, butter has very low. In fact, breast milk has low deuterium, which is interesting. There's a reason for that, because the mother doesn't want to give the infant too much deuterium, right? It's a very natural benefit of breast milk.
Can't seem to find that one at the store for some reason.
Cow's milk also, and then butter even more. So butter is because there's so much fat, and the animals make fats using enzymes that deplete the deuterium.
Okay, fats, cheeses, maybe.
Yeah, I think cheese would be good. Cottage cheese, I think, had relatively low. Coconut oil. Coconut oil was. I'm trying to remember. There's only a few foods that have been tested. I have been trying to find more numbers, but I know coconut oil was low, and I think avocado oil was low, and then of course butter and ghee. I think ghee might be even lower. GHE. Am I saying that right? The Indian butter. I think it's even better than butter on average.
So do you think that it's actually possible to consume a diet that doesn't have any glyphosate in it whatsoever?
It's possible, but you'd have to live on another planet, I think.
Really?
Like, you think
I
that
think it's
just
hard to
so in the
find
food
here.
supply?
You
Well,
can't just
especially
avoid wheats or.
No, everything. I mean, so Zen Honeycutt is a friend of mine, and she's the founder of Moms Across America. I probably talked about her last time.
Briefly,
She's
yeah.
been doing tests on various things. In fact, she found glyphosate in breast milk, which she got from her mothers. Her mothers are very helpful. Her mother's got samples of school lunches. She found glyphosate in 95% of the samples that were tested. Her mother's got fast food samples. She sent those off and got 100% contamination with glyphosate in this fast food. It's all over our food supply in this country.
But I would hope that organic foods or European pastas or something would save us from this. But why is that not the case?
European pastas would still have glyphosate unless they're also organic, and even organics can test positive. I have let's see.
How's that? How's that? It's just getting into the waters.
Well, it's in the rain. I tested it, and I got a rain sample in Cambridge outside my office at MIT, and it tested positive for glyphosate.
It tested positive at what level?
I don't know. Anthony Samsel is my friend, and I sent it off to him, and he said, "Yep, that one's got glyphosate." The other two didn't. I got one from my house in Winchester, Massachusetts, and one from my house in Hawaii, and both of them were clean, but the Cambridge sample came out positive.
Well, if it's an inverted dose response curve, then less is
I know
better.
small amounts
That's
can
really,
cause
really
terrible
terrible.
things.
Yeah.
I tried briefly to Google around about that low dose hypothesis, and it seems like the mechanism, obviously we touched on, is still wanting, but also that they weren't able to replicate it in humans for some reason. But I assume that's because you can't really experiment on humans very easily.
What weren't they able to replicate?
The low versus high dose.
Specifically of glyphosate?
I believe
or?
it was with glyphosate. Sorry, this was 15 minutes ago.
You might have found something written by the industry.
I'm sure it
Not be
was. I'm sure it
surprised.
was. I'm just,
Yeah,
it's such an interesting, it really makes this a really difficult theory to prosecute, right? Especially if you're talking about long-term exposure coupled to low dose interactions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the problem. I think that the long term is a critical problem, and also the constant, because it accumulates in your tissues. I was actually really surprised, and maybe not unexpected, but there's a book out. There's a book that's going to come out, and I've been given a copy so I can write a blurb, write a review of it. And she does case studies. It's a great book. It's talking about all the toxic exposures and how much trouble we have. And in that book, she talked about one patient who had been exposed to a lot of glyphosate as a child, and who got quite sick as an adult with things like polycystic ovary syndrome and various kind of metabolic problems. And she actually got a biopsy of a fat sample from that person and found, I think, significant levels of glyphosate in that. It was actually the biggest chemical that she found. The highest levels of anything was glyphosate in the fat tissue. And she mentioned she was surprised because glyphosate's water soluble, which is true. And in fact, Anthony Samsel told me, and I think he's right. He said he thinks that glyphosate is acting as a phosphate mimetic and binding to the lipids in place of phosphate. And so it's instead of phospholipids, it's glyphosolipids or something like that. It's actually replacing the phosphate. So even though it's not fat soluble, it gets into the fats.
Has there been any work done to see how long it takes for it to clear from an organism? Like you said that there's the study on the bacteria where it's you give a single dose, 3 weeks later they seem to start recovering. Is that but it feels plausible that if you accumulate a dose over the course of a lifetime, that it would take a really long time to clear it from the body.
I think that's a huge problem. I certainly think that many people in America today have glyphosate all over their bodies, stuck to various proteins in various places, causing various kinds of problems. And it's sort of, it's like shooting bullets throughout your body, because any kind of protein that ends up with a glyphosate substitution for glycine in some critical spot where that glycine is essential for that protein's function, then that protein misbehaves and causes disease. And it can be many, many different proteins. And of course, collagen is a big one, because collagen and glyphosate. Anthony Samsel found glyphosate in collagen. He found it in gelatin, desserts, like Jell-O. He found it in a bone. He got a bone from the butcher, and he found glyphosate in the bone. That's he found it in the hoof of a horse that had died of founder. I mean, it is in collagen, no question about it. And it's not surprising, because collagen has this long sequence of GXY, 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 where every third amino acid is a glycine. And that's critical for its formation into the triple helix structure that gives it its properties, its wonderful properties of elasticity and water absorption, all the things that collagen does for you in all of it's the glue that holds your body together. And there's more collagen by far than any other protein in our body. Like almost a third of our proteins are collagen molecules. And I think glyphosate is all over them. And that's why we're having so many issues with various diseases of the joints and the bones, and all the aches and pains, the back pain, all these different problems that people are suffering from, ending up with an opioid crisis. I suspect glyphosate is a major player in all of that.
You might think with all of this research coming out that people would be scaling back their glyphosate use, but
well, it's not like people are necessarily. You're thinking about like rurally, like on people's lawns and stuff like that?
Yeah, just in general. But I just saw this. I'm looking over your shoulder at this article you're reading, and it says that actually the opposite has happened, because with the introduction of these monocrops, these genetically modified organisms, glyphosate resistance appeared. And so they've completely ramped up the use of glyphosate in the last 10 years. It says about 2/3 of the total mass that's ever been sprayed has been used just in the last decade. And
yeah,
so
it's really that's
on the
what
rise.
I realized too. But because the weeds are becoming resistant, and it's because maybe they're picking up the resistance gene. I don't know, but the weeds are becoming resistant, so you have to use more and more. And in fact, they're now mixing other things in with the glyphosate. Absolutely. And it happened right away. Not too long after they started doing the GMO Roundup Ready crops, they started to run into this problem. Dicamba. So there's a formula now that they offer, which is glyphosate plus dicamba. Dicamba is another herbicide, probably just as bad. I mean, the herbicides, I think they're all very toxic. So they mix the two together in the formulation, and then they have GMO Roundup Ready crops along with dicamba resistance, a GMO dicamba resistance gene. So you sell the crop that has resistance to both of those, and then you put both of those on your crop. And the dicamba has caused a huge headache for the neighboring crop farms that don't have the resistance gene, and their crop is getting killed by the dicamba that's being used by their neighbor. There's a whole bunch of lawsuits going on. That's been quite a nightmare.
Well, and the way that they spray has changed too, because I remember reading that initially the application was directly to the ground with people that were walking around with sprayers. And now you have aerial application. And we were we were at the climbing gym the other day, and there was a group of people that were working on a drone in the parking lot. And, we went over there, and it was this like really kind of big.
It was basically an airplane without a pilot.
Yeah. And we were kind of, just asking them about it. And they were like, oh, we're developing these autonomous drones for spraying agricultural products.
Wonderful.
In order.
That's
and so they're basically like, we're trying to make it super affordable for everybody to have a drone to be able to spray. And there were
Oh
all these
boy.
like young kids really, really enthused about
They didn't seem
the
to know
machine.
much about the outcome of it, which is really interesting.
No,
They
I
didn't
mean,
know
like
that
their
it
job
was
is to make the
toxic, right?
machine.
No, they weren't even. They were just trying to build airplanes. But
Yeah.
that's the funny thing about being a scientist in this world today is that you end up working on some tiny little thing that doesn't necessarily have a vision for where it's going to be placed into the universe at the end, which is
Yeah, a
bit
lot of
tragic.
people are just driven by the curiosity of how this works. And I think they can end up producing something really monstrous by virtue of their curiosity without really thinking about it. The atom bomb would be a good example, but
Yeah, we just read actually. We did a little podcast on our own last week, I think it was, where we read Ayn Rand's MIT address from I think it was '62. She gave an address at MIT,
okay.
and she was essentially telling love or hate Ayn Rand, it doesn't really matter, but she was making this really salient point that you guys are the brains of the country. You should be thinking about what's the ultimate application of your work, because if you don't, somebody else is going to do it, and that's just of course she was suffering under the nuclear terror of the day, and that was the main pressing issue. But you see it more than ever today, where these scientists just have their heads down working on, like you said, fair enough, motivated by curiosity, but what's going to be done with the product of your labor? That's
Yeah.
something we all as scientists have to be asking ourselves at this early stages in our career.
I
So-
know. I think biology has gotten way out of hand because we have developed skills to do incredible things, like just inserting a gene from a bacteria into a plant. That's the GMO technology. And CRISPR technology, which is, you can pretty much write your own code, whatever you want to put in there, just put it in with CRISPR. And of course, CRISPR has a whole bunch of unknowns as well. It misbehaves and does some crazy things that we don't quite understand. But what the hell? Just go ahead, let's try it. There's a naivety about what could go wrong that shocks me.
How much is that in play? How much are people using CRISPR right now? Do you know?
Well, a lot. I think
Yeah.
they're very excited about it, and they're thinking they can use it to actually fix somebody's genetic mutation. Like if you've got a severe genetic mutation that's going to kill you, you're going to die at a young age. To actually be able to use CRISPR to fix that is a sort of a dream that they have,
Right.
which sounds wonderful, right? So it's kind of like, shouldn't we do this? I mean, you could ask.
But I wonder how much it's actually, Anastasia actually just ran into the lady who invented it on the street a few months ago. She lives here in Berkeley, I guess.
Wow.
And she asked her to do the podcast, but she refused. But yeah, I haven't heard a lot of CRISPR success stories in the real world yet. It was such a big deal when it came out, but I haven't seen it implemented in anything clinical wide scale that I've seen headlines about.
I think they've run into trouble every time they've tried.
I think that they haven't been able, there's no real tests in humans. There are papers that say that they're using it inside of mouse models and probably monkey models as well. And so, I think that it makes sense that there would be a long, slow road towards using it in humans. But I think that every time that they have started to work on it, there's the problem of off-target effects, because CRISPR is not a particularly specific enzyme. And so you might fix the thing that you're trying to fix, but then
what do you break? What do you break in the meantime? That's the big question. It's Russian roulette.
Yeah.
So my question is, like, how dependent are we on glyphosate? Like, is it something where people are going to starve to death and that'll be worse if we stop using glyphosate?
That's what they say, right?
Yeah.
That's what the industry says. They like to paint the model that, well, do you want to starve? We can't grow food without glyphosate. That's what they say. It is absolutely not true. I absolutely believe it's not true. We lived without it, right? Humans lived without glyphosate up until just 30, 40 years ago. How did we do that, right? And we lived without poisons, actually. It was really only after World War II that we got this brilliant idea of putting poisons all over our crops. It is such a stupid idea, in my opinion.
Like, how big a problem were weeds? Like, yeah, were weeds really that big of a... I don't know. I've never grown industrial scale agriculture.
Yeah, by virtue of being able to just nuke the weeds with the glyphosate, you don't have to hire a lot of farmers, a lot of people to do the agricultural work. So you save a lot on human labor. That's the big deal. You have this massive farm that's nothing but corn as far as the eye can see. And you have just a handful of people managing this entire huge area. growing all this corn. So the one thing it would be is we would have to have more people involved in agriculture as a career choice. And I actually think I would like to see young people think of buying a small plot of land, only a few acres, even like a 3-acre farm. You can plant a lot on 3 acres and grow a diversity of foods in an eco-friendly environment where you've got, fruits, all kinds of different crops growing together. And like you say, I mean, what if you just let the weeds grow? What happens? I don't know. I'm not a farmer. Pulling them by hand, is heavy labor and not fun. And so people don't generally want to do that. I think robots could be the answer in some of these fields, because there is a robotic tractor called the Monarch that has been under development for some time now, and I think it's starting to become um, practical. It's run by solar energy, and it's got AI technology. Like, it can actually use vision to recognize weeds, and then it could spray them with boiling water or something like that, directly hitting the weed and avoiding the plant. There are ways in which you could kill the weeds, I think, through using robotics, that wouldn't be costly, because you wouldn't have human labor involved, as much human labor.
I mean, there's also an argument to be made. We were thinking about this just the other day. Like, there's a lot of people that I run into who have gone through college. They have graduated with a degree in something, and now they have an email job that they kind of hate. Like, I actually ran into my parent. We're staying at my parents' house right now, and so I ran into my parents' neighbor's kid. So it was a girl who grew up next to me. She went to school. I think she studied public health or something like that. And now she just has an email job, and she helps people do mortgages. And she doesn't really like it. She has to do it because she needs to do something for money. And so life is just this endless stream of tasks that she's doing for a company that she doesn't really care about that much. And I wonder, I'm like, if we had more of a culture that you could go live and work on a farm and you could develop these abilities, you'd work probably as much as you do behind a computer. Like, it would definitely be a full-time job. I don't think that you could also be, an artist and a writer and do any of the sort of creative pursuits that require long stretches of idle time. Like, I don't know if you could be both a scientist and a farmer. I don't know.
Anthony Samsel does that. He has this small organic farm.
Okay.
I don't think he sells what he makes. He eats his own food, so he basically supports his family on his own small farm. And then he's a scientist as well. He's a very industrious scientist, so it's possible. I think farming doesn't look to me like one of the most hideous jobs in the world. If you had your own farm, and you had some animals, some sheep, let's say, I think it could be pretty pleasant, and have some fruit trees. And
you can start small too, right? Like, even if you just grow one thing 1 year, it's amazing how much livelier your plate becomes. Even if you're just growing your own tomatoes, or we grew a bunch of arugula. We've grown a few. We've not grown a lot of different things, but when those peppers were incredible. We were just eating these little, what are they called? Shishitos, yeah, just plates and plates of them, just so delicious. And so I think it's something that you can do. And we're unbelievably busy. We had hardly enough time to keep our garden running, but you set up a little irrigation system, tend to it a little bit, an hour a day or whatever, and you can kind of move in that direction. So I think it is doable on a smaller scale, even if you're not going to become a full-fledged farmer.
It is doable.
I remember, actually, my mom's parents, we visited our grandparents periodically, and they had a small farm. They had some cattle. They had a chicken coop. They had a vegetable garden. They grew watermelons. They canned beans. I mean, they actually pretty much lived off the land. They were, I know, I would almost say they were off the web. They were like one of those people who learned how to live without relying on the rest of the world. Looking back, I didn't appreciate at the time how wonderful that was. But in looking back, they had their own well water. They pretty much were independent of the world practically. And it didn't look that hard to me what they were doing. They just had cattle, and they sold them for beef, and I'm sure their income wasn't great, but they got by.
I think that's there's two things here that I always start to think about. Number one is the income isn't great, and I think a lot of people are really concerned about that because they need to have a job that pays them well so that they have a retirement, so that when they get old, they have some cushion and they're not having to, clean out the chicken coop when they're 85 or something, because this is what their life depends on. And so I think that because farming doesn't really pay and it's something that doesn't allow you to ever take your foot off the accelerator, I think that it's a hard sell. Because this
Not
links,
only that.
hold on. This links into the other larger point, which is that in some ways, civilization, this interconnected network of people that are offshoring some set of responsibilities onto somebody else so that they can do something else with their time, it was invented because people who farmed didn't want to keep farming to some degree. Don't you think?
I was going to say people like to live in the city.
Yeah.
Maybe to dumb down your thesis a little bit, there's good reason, especially for young people. This is a huge crisis from what I hear. There's a lot of older people where we live out in the country in Oregon, and all the kids move to the city. And it's really hard to get the kids to come back because city life is convenience and it's got culture and fun and parties and bars and everything that you want as a young person. And I think it's hard for someone to even imagine growing tomatoes when they live in a high-rise apartment.
Yeah, and I think that that's a trend that's not necessarily going to reverse, and we're also tied into each other, that I feel like because I think about this all the time. I'm like, you can get off the grid, and you can go, and you can break with society, and you can live your life, and I think that it is very, very possible. And yet, I feel a great responsibility for the structures in which we live. I'm like, well, we need to fix this. Because if they're spraying glyphosate everywhere, and it's getting in the groundwater, and it's in the rain, and it's in the wind, and it's in the fields next door, that's not really a solution to the problem to get off grid, because it's still going to be coming in at you from everywhere.
And if you have an organic farm and you're surrounded by non-organic farms, good luck with that, right? It's not going to be easy to maintain that.
Or even the soil that you buy or that you start to grow on. Like if you buy land that's been used.
Oh, I know, that's another issue for sure.
Like it
takes a long time to get rid of those chemicals that are already in the soil, and the soil, of course, is a mess as well. The microbes have been killed. The earthworms are very sensitive to glyphosate. They become paralyzed, and they can't do their job. And earthworms are very important for aerating the soil and for cleaning up the recycling the garbage, right, to turn it into soil. Mm-hmm. They're very effective for those. They play an important role in the soil, and they're dying off because of the glyphosate.
What was that? What are the effects that were seen on soil microbes?
Oh, well, that's what, when I heard Don Huber talk, that was one of the things he focused on, because he was a plant pathologist, and he understood that the soil was essential. The microbes in the soil were essential for the plant health. And one of the things he talked about was like the nitrogen fixing bacteria were getting messed up by glyphosate. And so the plant wasn't getting enough nitrogen. There were all kinds of minerals that weren't being taken up by the plant, because that depends upon these microbes that help them to get the minerals. The microbes in the soil are like the microbes in the gut, and they keep the plant healthy, and they get killed by glyphosate. And so the soil imbalance of the microbiome of the soil causes the plants to be weak, and their immune system is weak, and they can't even fight off insects very well, or fungus infection. So you get these other problems. And then you have to use fungicides and insecticides. So all the chemicals go up because the glyphosate has made the plant sick, really, and less resistant.
Has anyone looked to see the direct line between the consumption of these sorts of depleted microbial populations in soils and how they affect the human gut microbiome?
Well, I don't know specifically about that, but people have written about the soil microbes and also about the earthworms in the soil. I have done studies on them to show. In fact, I wrote about one of those studies in my book. Was really fascinating about these earthworms. They expected glyphosate would make the earthworms happy because it would produce more. It produced more organic matter for the earthworms to eat, and they expected them to thrive. And actually, they didn't. In fact, they got paralyzed. They couldn't even get to the surface, and so they weren't doing their job because of the glyphosate exposure.
That's crazy.
Was anybody thinking about this when they introduced glyphosate? Do you have
Apparently
a sense?
not.
Yeah, like what was I'm really curious what the temperature of the room was when all of these chemical solutions to agriculture and everyday living were introduced back in, I don't know, when was this, the 40s, 50s?
Well, glyphosate was in the 70s, like 75. Yeah, it's interesting to think about how those first people who decided that it would be okay to put poisons on the food, because I would have really been nervous if I were the one who decided that we were going to try to do this. I would be really nervous about the consequences, you know.
And maybe it's just that they hadn't seen long-term effects of anything before. Maybe they were just completely naive. I don't know.
Yeah, it could be that they just kind of thought, well, it'll just wash off and it won't really be in the food and there won't be enough, you know, to cause trouble. I don't know. It's
Yeah.
surprising to me that and it's surprising to me today that they still say, oh, yeah, you know, it's just a little bit. It's pretty harmless. We don't care how much there is. I mean, the government doesn't bother to test for glyphosate. We rely on these people like Zen Honeycutt to do the tests. Even to know that there is glyphosate in our food is because of them, not the government.
Yeah, the short-sightedness is just shocking to me because I like to think that we're an intelligent race of animals that can solve our
Yeah, I
problems.
know.
It's really shocking. You know, there's something similar out here. We have all these forest fires in the West, and they
Yeah.
spray this Phos-Chek stuff on the forest fires. And at some point, there was a class action lawsuit against the USDA for this Phos-Chek business, which I guess was causing all sorts of diseases. And the crazy thing, they won a huge settlement, but the only policy change that resulted was that they couldn't spray it within, I think, 300 feet of a river. Maybe it was meters. Anyways, the problem is, if you've ever been to Oregon, or California for that matter, is it's all hills, right? So you have the system of mountainous or terrain or hills, and when it rains, it doesn't matter how far away you are from the river, it's gonna roll down into the river at the end of the day anyways. And so it
Yeah.
just seemed like such a preposterous solution to the problem that okay, we'll just stay away from the rivers. And I'm just I can't believe this is what the best minds have come up with in
I
our
think the
civilization.
forest fires are being driven by glyphosate. I think you probably know that they're using glyphosate in the forest to kill the hardwood trees so that they can plant the pine trees and let them grow fast. Pine trees grow fast, and so the toilet paper industry cares about that. And the paper mills, the paper industry are really. I've looked into that. It's amazing how much glyphosate they're using in the forest to kill the hardwood trees. And I think that's causing glyphosate is a desiccant, so I think that's causing the forest to dry out, and that's why we've had these incredible. I think it's a major player in the forest fires that you guys have been faced with these past years.
Yikes. Yeah, there seems to be a lot of perverse incentives regarding the forest fires. It's really interesting. You know, I brought it up before, but it's worth mentioning that we've talked to some people who are fighting these forest fires, and there seems to be this strange incentive to allow them to reach some scale. They essentially get federal relief to the tune of millions of
Mm-hmm.
dollars when these forests reach some critical threshold. And we couldn't get anybody to come on the record and say this. We actually had someone lined up, and then he just disappeared. I think he didn't want to lose his job or something, but he
Yeah.
was like, "Look, yeah, we're being told to kind of stand back and let these things burn." And you know, you look at the region after this has gone down, and it's understandable. Like they got a brand new highway out there in near Cave Junction, right? There was this huge fire out by the coast. I mean, they really did get a massive update to the city infrastructure, regional infrastructure,
That's really
as a
interesting.
result of it. And so, you know, you can see how everybody's kind of like, well, it's not so bad, you know?
Wow.
I
Yeah.
I'm perplexed because like yes, there's all these incentives and obviously there's these massive systems that are at play, right? We live inside of a system that it's a machine that runs. And you can try to press on some portion of it to change how it runs, but these decisions are being made at a level that is, multiple layers of the machine above us. And so there's little that can be done to influence that. But I go back and I think about Silent Spring, because Silent Spring is the classic book in this vein of literature, which is that biologist goes out, sees something weird in the woods, starts to investigate, is able to pull together all of these different people who conclude that it is, in fact, DDT. She makes the argument in front of Congress. Eventually, DDT gets banned. And there's a huge outcry over it, and it's maintained as this massive victory for the environmental movement that happened in the last 100 years. why is there not a Silent Spring type moment for this right now? Is it just that there's too many of these substances and the crisis is so big? Is it that there isn't a centralized channel for information to flow through? Is it that
Is Monsanto too powerful?
and is able to just label people as dangerous or full of misinformation? Or like, what do you make of this? Why is this
I
such a
think
hard sell?
probably all of that. I mean, the industry is very good at controlling the politics and the legislatures, and they just prevent these bills from ever getting into law. I mean, right now, Monsanto, Bayer is working hard at the state level. I think it's Iowa, Idaho, Iowa, and Missouri, I believe, 3 states, where they're working on bills try to get them passed into law that would protect Bayer from lawsuits against glyphosate. But all these lawsuits that they've gotten for the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, they're kind of arguing that glyphosate is essential. We can't afford to not have it, just like the vaccines. It's really a vaccine model. We really can't afford to not have glyphosate. So we have to not let these people destroy our product, or destroy our ability to make money. We can't let that happen. So we're going to have to pass a law that essentially exempts us the same way as they exempt the vaccine makers. They're working on that.
And so do you think that it just gets to a critical point where the damage is just so obvious that you can't deny it anymore, and that's what, ratchets us over into the next phase of greater regulation? Because this feels historically, if you look back through American history, there were companies that were destroying the environment, that were dumping toxic waste, and eventually they get regulated. And they get regulated largely because public will becomes so strong in favor of their regulation that there's almost nothing that can be done to prevent that from passing, because the government actually works and the people that are elected are dependent upon people to elect them. And so the will is so strong that they're able to do it. Why is the will not stronger here?
It's getting stronger, I feel. I mean, we've got 1 in 36 autism in this country now, which is, I think, absolutely shocking. And yet,
Really?
yeah.
1 in
You
36
didn't know
kids
that?
has autism?
Yeah.
That makes sense. I'm thinking about my own. I teach at this university in Oregon, and every year I feel like there's more and more disability list students. I'm like, what is going on?
Yeah, it's like it's like the
this?
frogs getting heated up in the water, right? People seem to adjust to the new normal too. Like, all these people have gluten intolerance, and they don't think about the fact that when I was a kid, nobody had gluten intolerance. Nobody.
How much is that as a measurement problem, though, where people are just kind of looking for it?
Well, that's what they always say, right? Oh, yeah, we're just diagnosing it more. 1 in 36 versus 1 in 10,000? I don't think so. You notice autism. It's not something you don't notice.
I found myself parroting all of the mainstream talking points in this conversation. I'm sorry, but I guess it keeps it interesting. Because, that's what people
that
will
really
say.
annoys me. The government seems to be willing to just keep saying that and therefore not acting on it. They don't seem to care to find out what's causing it. That's what's really frustrating to me. And when you look at glyphosate, there are so many different ways in which glyphosate matches what those kids are experiencing. Their illness is very clearly connected to glyphosate, in my view. I think it's the major player in the epidemic.
Okay, so is there a test case that can be done for this? Are there countries that have utterly banned glyphosate?
There are some countries that have banned it at times and then often brought it back because the farmers put too much pressure. Sri Lanka comes to mind. Sri Lanka banned glyphosate. I think Bermuda has banned it for a long time, but I'd have to fact check that. And some countries in Middle America, Nicaragua, for example, because their
So the farmers couldn't
dying.
compete?
The farmers were dying of kidney failure at a young age, like in their 40s. And they finally were able to, it was obvious to me that glyphosate was the cause. And that was another case where the industry was funding research to sort of point the other direction, try to come up with some other excuse for why these people were getting sick. These sugarcane farmers that were harvesting the cane with these big machetes, so you call it, right after the cane had been sprayed with glyphosate as a desiccant. So they're getting it up close and personal. And then they would have, their kidneys would get messed up by the glyphosate, and then they would be very sick. And
is that a high dose situation with the kidney toxicity? Is that something that
in
Monsanto
that case,
knows
it's going to
about?
be a high dose. I mean, I can't imagine Monsanto doesn't know. In fact, I think they were pretty sure that glyphosate, I'm speaking out of turn. I mean, I haven't asked them, but I would imagine they were pretty sure glyphosate was causing it. And they commissioned studies. They would fund, research to find out what's causing it, as long as you don't mention glyphosate. Come up with something else.
Do you know any scientists at Monsanto? Have you ever sat down with any of these people?
No.
Oh, it would be so interesting. I mean, I've always had this little thought that what would it be like to go and try to work inside of one of these companies and change things from the inside, which I know is terribly naive, but I wonder if there's anybody like that who's hanging out at Monsanto and is like really pushing people like, guys, let's do the right thing. I wonder if there's anybody
You
like
would
that.
hope, wouldn't you? I would imagine there must occasionally be someone who doesn't realize when they come in, and then finally when they see the evidence, they realize, and then they don't know. It's probably a crisis for them.
Yeah, maybe they just go work somewhere else. I don't know. Maybe that's all it amounts to. It's very hard to change
It's
an
very few people
institution.
that are willing to confront these things, because you can get your life can be ruined,
Well, isn't that what happened to Tyrone Hayes at
Yes, well,
Berkeley?
he was tremendously harassed. This was the atrazine story, where he showed that the frogs exposed to atrazine, male frogs would develop into completely female. They had complete female organs, and they could make viable eggs. And they had a Y. They had the male gene, the Y, chromosome, but it didn't protect them from becoming female.
So, atrazine, link that.
It's an herbicide.
Herbicide, gotcha.
And so he was doing research on exposure of amphibians to atrazine, and he found that
Tadpoles, it was tadpoles, and they were exposed to atrazine, and then they developed incorrectly, and the males became females.
And what was
despite
the
the Y
harassment
gene.
that he experienced?
Well, Syngenta was the maker of atrazine, and they actually even threatened him. I mean, he had a very hard time with. They tried to discredit his work, all the stuff that they do.
Turning males into females seems marketable in our day and age.
Well, we like males that are females, right? We're fine with that.
I think it seems like a product. There's a product opportunity there.
So, Tyrone Hayes comes as an example of a researcher that's been actively harassed, and he's been really loud about declaring that is the case. Are there other people that you know of that this has happened to?
All of us. I mean, all of us have certainly suffered from abuse from the industry. There's no question. Anyone who goes against who hurts their product, huh?
I said, what are the kinds of things that have happened to you?
Well, just the papers can't get published. You can. I have stories there. In fact, I didn't finish that story about the paper that got retracted, because Entropy was the journal that published the first paper that Anthony and I wrote. And shortly after that paper got retracted, we got a note from the editor who asked us if we would be willing to withdraw our paper, which is a huge hint that they're getting ready to retract it if we say no. And we did say no. We said, no, we're not going to withdraw.
On what grounds?
Waiting. Huh?
On what grounds?
I don't know. They didn't even give us grounds.
Really?
They just gave us a hint that we're going to do something with your paper if you don't do something first, right?
Oh, no.
Because you don't want to have a retraction. A retraction is a black eye. They can really hurt your career if you have a retracted paper. And so we were very worried about what was going to come next. And then oddly, a week later, they basically sent another email message saying, sorry, no, never mind, we didn't mean it, type of thing. And then they published something on their webpage that said, we're not going to bow to the pressure of people who don't like, a paper that we published, went through the proper review process, we published it. We're not going to bow to the pressure of these people and take it out just because they want us to, something of that sort. They wrote something nice that basically defended our paper, and it still stands. That paper's still there. So we were lucky that we didn't get the retraction, but I send papers off that are perfectly, appropriate for the topic of the journal, and they bounce it back without review. They just say, they don't even say we don't want to touch this paper, but that's what they mean. They just don't want to go there. Very, very hard. And then a journal will accept it for review, and then they'll sit on it for months and months. And then they'll finally send it back and say, sorry, we can't review this paper. So they'll waste time.
Have there been any journals that are particularly open to these ideas?
Yeah, there are some, and many of them are, of course, outside of PubMed. I mean, if you're willing to go outside of PubMed, you can find people who are willing to publish your work, and some of them are very dedicated to that. But their journal doesn't count. I mean, it's a completely invisible journal. So
Yeah, how does
It's
something end up outside of PubMed? I was under the impression that
there's a whole
PubMed.
space of journals outside of PubMed, and people don't realize that. PubMed is a club, and you
Mm,
can't get into PubMed if you published stuff that goes against what the industry wants to see. Your journal will
interesting.
not be able to go into PubMed.
Or how does that work? Like, is
I mean, I
there,
don't know the whole process, but it's very clear to me because, and in fact, I find I like to do searches in Google Scholar, and even in Consensus is a fancy search engine. These things are, they will find papers that are not in PubMed. If you just search PubMed, find that you come up short because you don't really get the interesting papers. And I think
PubMed's
that
like the state-sponsored repository, I suppose. So that kind of makes sense.
it's very much there's a censorship going on that's pretty strong. That yeah, very difficult to get your paper published in a journal that is listed in PubMed if you're saying something that the industry doesn't like.
Mm. I'm surprised that Google's as remains free.
I don't know how free it is, but Google Scholar does pull up things that are outside of PubMed. Of course, it also pulls up things that aren't even necessarily peer reviewed. Probably, I'm not. I think so.
Yeah, we had an angry fan one time write a scree about us and publish it, I think, to ResearchGate or something, and now it shows up on my Google Scholar. It's like not even, it's not a publication or anything. It just happens to have my name in it. Very strange.
what's the,
Yeah,
what's the political will like to change this? Because surely the the path towards changing the course of this has to do with getting representatives and people that have their hands on the level of power to be aligned with this cause and then able to actually push back against it. And I know that RFK is kind of on this side, but he's viewed as, he's been binned, unfortunately and unfairly, as being, a fringe candidate. Are there people that are aligned with him that are trying to bring this into the mainstream and into the public eye, or is this mainly happening behind the scenes and behind this gate of censorship?
I don't know. I mean, all of us who are working in this space are frustrated by the inability to get our message out to the mainstream. It's just the way the world is right now. Tremendous censorship, not just in publishing, but also in the search engines.
Do you see a
And
way back from that?
I don't know. There's a lot of control. I mean, there are certainly some things that are happening, but I don't know. It's difficult to fight back. There's so much power. I mean, the pharmaceutical industry has a huge amount of money, and they spread it around to all kinds of people who might cause trouble in order to keep them from causing trouble. So I think there's a tremendous censorship of messaging around some of these things that are important to get out. So I was very frustrated with. I guess I was naive in the beginning when I realized that glyphosate is most likely the cause of autism. I thought this is amazing. We got to get this message out. I was very passionate about it, and I somehow naively thought that it would become clear and the government would act on it. That it would. I've been at this for more than 10 years now, and the government is still completely enthusiastic about glyphosate. The U.S. government. They have no interest in banning it or restricting it in any way, it seems to me. I don't know. It's frustrating, very frustrating for me that the government can't see what's going on. That's why I would love to see Bobby Kennedy as the president. I think that would be amazing. And I wish there were a way it could happen, but of course he's being censored tremendously also.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I personally think it's the new nuclear threat. This censorship industrial complex really, really worries me more than almost anything in the world right now. It's just that, the promise of this free world, this Western civilization based on democratic ideals and so forth, it only can possibly function if we all have access to information. How are we to make our minds up otherwise if we're just getting a bunch of garbage all the time and there's nowhere to even turn? It really, really seems like a much more important issue than people tend to think on the street. People are afraid of global warming. They're afraid of, let's say, war from the East. They're afraid of all of these old problems, I feel like, that are nowhere near as threatening as not having free information to make decisions by. It's like, how can we possibly orient this ship? How can we steer the thing without being able to see?
But there are, I think, I feel like there's a growing community of people who are aware that the government is not to be trusted and that the pharmaceutical industry is off on the wrong track.
But
I
even
don't
that's
trust the
terrifying.
pharmaceutical industry at all.
If you can't
So
trust
then
your
you
government, my God, like what,
can't trust your government, you can't trust your doctor. I mean, that is pretty hard, isn't it? It's a
right?
hard place to be. I feel that way.
And that's what's scary is that I agree that you can't maybe trust the things that we were raised believing we could trust. And that creates a really unstable situation that I don't want to face either, which is that,
Yeah.
this isn't a very reliable structure for all of us to be living under. And so what's the inevitable outcome of that? That's never good either.
Yeah, I certainly think the government needs to wake up and realize that the population is sick. I mean, I think it's obvious that the population is sick, especially the children. And the government ought to be very, very concerned about that. And then they ought to be investing money in trying to figure out what's going on. And if they would try to figure out, they would quickly see that it's the poisons that we're exposed to all the time. And then to think about how do we get rid of those poisons and then to act on that. It seems so simple to me, you know? The government should be doing that and they're just sleeping on the job.
Do you know of any research groups that are working on alternatives to Roundup, or is the alternative basically a shift towards regenerative agriculture?
Well, I think regenerative is really a very, very good idea. And I think there's people who are doing the research to figure out how to do that effectively and focusing on improving the soil in the same way that you would improve your gut microbiome is very important. And they're learning how to do it. And I have a lot of hope for them. And like I said, possibly we can use technology to help control the weeds, for example, without having to use poisons. If we can, I think that would be great, you know?
And so what are you in general most optimistic about?
Most optimistic about?
Yeah.
I would say, certainly Bobby Kennedy and regenerative agriculture. And there's books coming out. I think quite a few books coming out that are pointing out that we're sick because of our poisons and we have to do something about it. So there's a lot of individuals who have woken up and who have become passionate about trying to get the message out. I know a lot of people who are very dedicated to trying to inform the public about what's going on and to get them aware so that they can, and then to encourage people to do simple things like buying organic food. I'm finding more and more. I was so pleased yesterday. I'd been checking in my local grocery store. I buy an organic ham and an organic cheese for my sandwiches for lunch. And I've checked at that store many times and they never have it. They've never had it. And I thought, well, let me just check one more time. And there it was. I was so thrilled. I have to buy it at the organic store, because the main store doesn't carry it. And there it was. And I was just so thrilled to see that they were now carrying that. So I think slowly but surely, the organic foods are showing up on the shelves of the mainstream grocery stores. And I think that's very encouraging.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think when everything is driven by markets, that consumers actually have a lot of power where they put their money down. That might be the most optimistic lining of this whole thing.
Yeah, I think it's the best thing. I think if we can get individual, like moms, and this is the thing with Moms Across America, I really like Sam Honeycutt with her attitude of just getting moms aware of the need to feed their family healthy foods and really emphasizing certified organic and of course, local farm, buy from your local farmer if you can. And just to encourage people to be aware of the need for healthy food. And I think if we could just get the moms on board, then the kids would get healthier, and as long as there's food that's available and market driven approaches work really well because the market works well. When somebody wants something, then usually someone wants to supply it.
Mm.
Definitely.
Hopefully those robot tractor guys can get some claws into the government themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would hope we could do it without the government, actually. I've always felt grassroots bottom up might be a better approach. The government will be a Johnny come lately to the scene, after everyone has already solved the problem without them. Because we don't have to buy the poisonous food just because the government allows them to make it. We can vote with our pocketbooks.
If only it weren't raining down upon us.
I mean, I think that this thought of young people figuring out how to make a life in agriculture and taking care of the earth is the grassroots equivalent of the CCC back in the day. And I know that there's the program WOOFing, which is World's Organic Farming Federation. There's another O in there, which I don't necessarily remember. But basically, people can go work on an organic farm anywhere in the world.
Right.
For free, or sometimes even you get a stipend. You can learn the techniques, and then you can come back to the United States and figure out
like
how
an
to make that
apprenticeship.
possible. Yeah, because I think that a lot of this knowledge is really difficult, and you can watch YouTube videos and figure it out, but it's easier if you have somebody who teaches you. And so finding ways into these organizations that have the culture that can show you the way to actually live a life that is not the 9 to 5 urban commute email job, I think is
Yeah.
really the way forward. And I think you're right that the government can't do this for whatever reason. You can point to the
Yeah.
corruption, you can point to lobbying, you can point to the fact that people just want to grandstand and make noise, you can point to censorship. There's lots of reasons. And so it really is a time where if the world is going to be different, then we have to encourage people to take the leap into the unknown and to make the world what they want it to be. And in this case, it's like clean air, clean food, clean water. And that's a really
Yeah, it's
beautiful
so
vision.
basic and
Clean
it's so
information.
simple, really.
Yeah. It is very simple and it is very beautiful.
Mhm.
All right, Stephanie. I think that maybe we can leave it here for now. And
Okay.
we really look forward to your Deuterium book, and I hope that when it's together, you send us a copy, and we can have you back to talk about it
Yeah,
again.
that'd be fun.
We'd really
Thanks.
enjoy that.
Mm.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, have a great rest of your day.
You too.
All right, see you later.
Bye.
Bye.